105.5 Lumpen Radio. This is Sid Baluch and Nick Wylie coming to you with some Lumpen special coverage as part of a collaboration with an upcoming new Lumpen show, Queer And. Nick visited the current exhibition at Wrightwood 659, the show The First Homosexuals Global Depictions of a New Identity, 1869 to 1930, takes as its starting point the year 1869 when the word homosexual was first coined in Europe, inaugurating the idea of same-sex desire as the basis for a new identity category. Nick, what was your initial impression of the show?
Hi, yeah. I went right before the holiday shutdown of the exhibition, and it was packed, and lots of folks were in attendance with groups, and but were very reverent. Like it felt like sort of like a spiritual pilgrimage or something. Like people were super attentive to the show, and what might have felt like a bustling loud space was you could hear a pin drop. It was great, and I guess I'm supposed to talk a little. Sorry, this is one of my first times on Lumpen Radio. I've worked here for 5 years at PMI, but I was really excited about jumping on with you, Sid, to talk about this show specifically because we do a lot of queer curatorial work here at Co-Prosperity. We've done recent shows like Before the After Party and Shut Up Stone Mountain, and so I'm excited to have you on, Dr. Katz. Thank you for being here. We're going to dive in a little bit further into your background, but just wanted to say hi and welcome. Where are you coming to us from today, Dr. Katz?
I'm in Washington, D.C. Normally, I'm in Philadelphia.
Okay. Cool. So just going to introduce your background a little bit, and then we'll get into the questions. You are a founding figure in the queer art history world, responsible for the very first queer scholarship on a number of artists beginning in the early 90s here in Chicago. Your scholarship spans a period from the late 19th century to the present, with an emphasis on the U.S., but with serious attention to Europe, Latin America, and Asia as well. You have written extensively about gender, sexuality, and desire, producing some of the key theoretical works in queer studies in the visual arts. Katz has curated the first major museum exhibition in the U.S., the 2010 Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, which was attacked by Republicans and which resulted in an international censorship conflict over the removal of a film by David Wojnarowicz. His recent Chicago About Face, Stonewall, Revolt, and New Queer Art at 500 Works was the largest queer exhibition yet mounted, and one of the rare art shows that featured a majority of artists who were neither male nor white. You're currently a professor at the in the history of art and gender and sexuality and women's studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and are editing 2 anthologies, the Routledge Companion to Queer Art History and the About Face, Stonewall, Revolt, and New Queer Art catalog. So you're also hard at work with this newest exhibition, The First Homosexuals, and its current iteration and the one coming in 2025. So thank you for joining us. And
real pleasure.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on.
Yeah, and then just for our listeners, could you go ahead and let us know your pronouns as well?
Yes, so I'm a he, him, but, not rigid about it.
We love to hear that. All right. And then I think...
Yeah, I guess we could just get started. We'll dive into the show in a minute, but just noting that that some of your first activist and academic work happened in Chicago in the 80s and 90s, and now you've become the primary curator of queer museum shows here, again, via your work with Wrightwood and before that, Alphawood. Can you talk a little bit just about your relationship with this city back then and now?
Sure. So I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, where I was very much politically active, helping to found the Gay and Lesbian Town Meeting, which was the first organization to lobby successfully for civil rights protections for queer people in the city of Chicago. And I was sort of at that time, Chicago was a pretty rough place to be queer,
Mm.
and this was, of course, also at the beginning. This we're talking now, early '80s. This was also the beginning of the plague,
Mm-hmm.
and so there was a lot of activism. And it's almost like two different cities. I mean, I
Mm.
remember a board hearing where uh, various relatively primitive members of the board were saying things like, you must be allowed to discriminate against queers because everyone knows that queer sexual practices involve copious amounts of excrement, which befouls the carpets and the drapes.
Wow.
And so that kind of prejudice is an economic basis, not a
Wow.
prejudicial one. That was the attitude.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that is now long in the past.
Yeah. And you were able to win protections, is that right, with your early activism for queers in Chicago?
Yes, it ultimately ended up passing in, I believe it was 1989.
Wow.
Um,
Amazing.
but I was involved with the queer group at the University of Chicago. I also worked with Mayor Harold Washington in outreach to queer community. So yeah, I did a lot of local politics.
Wow. And then just about like your kind of return to Chicago in the last decade or so, or even more recently with all these Rightwood projects. I don't know. Do you have kind of reflection on coming back and working?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, first thing, it's just so wonderful to come back.
Mhm.
Chicago's always been the place I loved the most.
Oh.
But more than that, what I'm struck by is the willingness um, among groups like Rightwood to support the development of a queer art history. It's quite
Mm.
remarkable these days to find queer art history uh, getting the kinds of budgets we're able to get at Rightwood 659, doing the kind of ambitious shows we do.
Yeah, that's amazing. And later on, we'll talk a little bit about your history with the Leslie Lohman Museum and these kind of like queer led spaces allowing for more freedom. But we kind of have a fun question next. I don't know.
Yeah, we were doing our prep work for the show, and we kind of found the name doppelganger. So Jonathan Nedkatz, who's also a queer historian, who wrote about the homosexual heterosexual binary.
Hmm.
Um, when did you guys like kind of become aware and meet your like influences with each other, and how was that relationship kind of?
We're friends, actually, and
Yeah.
I hired Jonathan Ned when I was teaching at Yale,
Huh.
in part so that we could have photo opportunities together and people could see that we were actually two different people. It is a very strange circumstance, uh, and uh, and Jonathan is actually a painter,
Mm-hmm.
so I curated an exhibition of his work at Leslie Lohman and written a catalog about his art. So we have a lot of overlapping interests. He's a wonderful guy.
Wow, that's so funny and great. I think we'll just we have a couple more like, kind of quick icebreaker questions, but I think we'll just skip ahead if that's okay with you, Sid,
Yeah.
to talk about the exhibition.
Absolutely. So, going back to the show, The First Homosexuals, Nick had a really like wonderful time going last week, and just seeing the way things were kind of categorized with these contextual revelations. Um, the show, one of those contexts that I put in is like this creation of a new binary and categories of identity. Can you explain to our listeners what was so groundbreaking about this new formation of identity?
Sure. So what I'm really interested in mapping in this show is the development of the term homosexual and the result of the development of that term, how it changed things. And basically what I'm trying to illustrate through the work is that, of course, there had always been same-sex relationships, but those same-sex relationships were understood as part of the grand possibilities of sexuality.
Hmm.
So there's an 1850s scroll by Japanese artist in the exhibition, which shows the sexual education of a young man, and he is having sex with young women. He's bottoming for a samurai. He's being groped by a male monk. He's then having sex with another woman. And what we find is that what we would call homosexuality and heterosexuality coexist with no polar or opposing relationship.
Hmm.
And what I wanted to show, and what the show fundamentally is about, is how and why sexuality became divided,
Mm-hmm.
how forms of sexuality that were once understood together came undone.
Hmm.
And what the show really wants to not sort of explore and illustrate is how, over time, what was once a term intended to constrain, to diagnose, to police,
Mm.
became the very banner under which we march.
Yeah. Huh. And I think like bringing up that work kind of gets to another thing we wanted to talk about, um, which is this like sort of idea of colonizing desire, right? That and I'm curious to think about how you relate this to your next another exhibition you're working on, the dispossessions in the Americas, the extraction of bodies, land, and heritage from La Conquista to the present, which seeks to explore complex histories of American colonialism in the Americas. But the first of homosexuals shows a kind of different vector of colonization in the ways that the West colonized the like ars erotica of non-Western cultures.
Exactly.
So can you talk about your decisions to highlight these sections in these sections, like the colonization of of, for instance, we're talking about like Asian depictions of sexuality in art and how they were sort of policing themselves after the invention of homosexuality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, one of the striking things we found was that the term homosexual became promoted by colonial powers and accompanied them on their conquests.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the great paradoxes of the exhibition is that there are various cultures now that are profoundly homophobic that were initially entirely welcoming of same sex desire, but following colonial law, the culture changed, and those very acts that were once celebrated are now outlawed.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what we wanted to do was to show that colonization, one of the roots for the development of the homosexual internationally, was hardly a positive
Mm.
one. And in, for example, even cultures like Japan, which was so open to same sex desire, uh, in 1869, paradoxically, not only was the word homosexual invented, but Japan was open to the West.
Mm.
And when Japan was open to the West, one of the first things they discovered was that they had to tamp down queer representation,
Mm-hmm.
precisely because it was precisely that which prevented their membership in the League of Nations.
Wow. Um, I guess just like a note about a surprising piece in these sections of the show that maybe has a little bit of a counter narrative there was the image of the Japanese soldier topping the Russian soldier, kind of like
Yes.
striking in the face of this other direction of kind of like orientalizing images that it shares space with. I remember just being sort of like floored by that. I guess it was a print. I don't know.
It was one of millions
Wow.
of those flyers that were dropped by the Japanese onto the Russian forces during the Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century.
Wow.
And as you note, they depict a Japanese soldier raping anally a Russian soldier. And we wanted to point out that images of queerness were not always in the course of celebrating queerness. They could also deploy homophobic mechanisms like this one did.
Wow. Yeah. Um, So we just have to pause for a minute for station ID, and we're talking to Dr. Jonathan David Katz about his exhibition the first homosexuals at Wrightwood 659. We'll be back in a minute.
Great.
Buddy is a shop and hub for making connections between friends we have and those we have yet to meet. Buddy Shop gives artists and small manufacturers in Chicago a place to showcase their work. It's brought to you by your friends at Lumpen Radio and Public Media Institute. More information and online shopping are at hi-buddy.org. Lumpen Radio is supported by Tangible Bookstore, now open in downtown Bridgeport. Tangible offers gently used books, magazines, and ephemera from 10 to 7 daily at 3324 South Halsted Street. More information about Tangible is available on their Facebook page. Tangible Books is a proud partner of Lumpen Radio. You are listening to Lumpen Radio, supported by Life on Mars Community Club, maker of the Mars Elixirs, infused with Midwestern hemp. Mars Elixirs are available at the Life on Mars tap room at 1950 Northwestern Ave in Logan Square. More information is at mars.beer. That's MARZ.beer. What's Mars is yours. Lumpen Radio is supported by Wrightwood 659, an exhibition space designed by Tadao Ando for architecture and socially engaged art in Lincoln Park. Through December 17th, Elfawood Exhibitions presents 2 new exhibitions at Wrightwood 659, including The First Homosexuals, Global Depictions of a New Identity, 1869 to 1930. A multi-medium survey of the first self-consciously queer art, including more than 100 artworks from collections around the globe. More information and tickets at wrightwood659.org. That's wrightwood659.org.
And we're back. You're listening to WLPN LP Chicago 105.5 Lumpen Radio. We're here with Jonathan D. Katz, curator of the First Homosexuals Global Depictions of a New Identity exhibition over at Wrightwood 659.
Welcome back, Jonathan. I wanted to sort of, again, with this kind of theme of colonization that we were talking about, warp that into a temporal colonization that artists in the show like F. Holland Day and many others at the time were doing of the ancient world of classical Greece and Rome, and sort of the conceptions these artists had of what it meant to be queer in those eras. Do you see a resonance between the way that they looked backwards or felt backwards into these times and the way that contemporary queer historians regard the folks in this show, the artists of modernity, before the advent of heterosexuality and homosexuality? These two sort of like, what was it to be queer back then, gazes, I guess. Are there, and I don't know, like, are there contemporary anxieties or taboos that might keep people from sort of idealizing these moments in the ways that maybe the moderns did? That's not too big a subject.
That's a great question.
Okay.
Yeah. So a couple of things to say. The first is that, of course, the idea of classical Greece was the locus classicus, pun intended, right, of homosexuality, precisely because it was understood as the place where homosexual relationships were not only normative, but celebrated.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In fact, what we now know is that those relationships should not be understood according to the terms of gender, because they were fundamentally about power. A man's relationship to another young man was similar to that man's relationship to a woman, to a slave, right? To that which was, by their culture, unempowered. So one could do whatever one wanted to do to somebody who stood below you on the social hierarchy. It's hardly the sort of zenith of homosexual rights that we now understand it to be, or misunderstand it to be. But one of the things that's really striking about what I think the image of Greece represented, and what the image of sexuality before 1869 represents for us now is the paradox that we are going backwards in order to go forwards. That we are finally getting to a place where we can come to understand that the binary construction and mutually exclusive construction of homo hetero is actually a blip in history, a short duration, and that in fact, when it's over, and I look forward to that day, we can all just be people together.
It's interesting you say like that reversal, especially with nowadays this trend of like purity culture kind of coming back into play. How do you kind of see that in terms of this continual journey of that binary?
Well, I have a nephew who's 17, and he was telling me about his dating life, and he just happened to drop this boy that he was dating. And, I was like, what? I had no idea. And I'm like, you didn't tell me. You have a gay activist uncle, blah, blah, blah. And
the betrayal.
You know what he said to me? He said was, God, you're so old-fashioned. And now he's with a woman. He doesn't think in terms of gender. And that's that young generation, right, just refuses these terms because they've come to understand that, as Freud put it, bisexuality is the human condition. And without a series of social and cultural restrictions, it will once again emerge.
Wow. I guess that's maybe a good segue into the visions of the future that the Clarists had, right?
Yeah.
Elisar von Kupfer and his collaborator von Meyer had a very different look at the classical than most of the other artists that we were maybe more familiar with in the show. Clarism sort of was this queer androgynous mysticism, like that came from what I understand as their sort of like radicalization in Pompeii, as this like, kind of queer couple traveling Europe, and then having this like new kind of very like trans feeling response to the scientific binaries of homo and heterosexual that Hirschfeld was talking about at the same time, and they were like in direct conversation opposition to that. I understand that in the next iteration of the show, which we haven't really talked about, the show is coming back in a fuller form in 2025, that some of this Clarist work, like which includes like cycloramas and a temple, is coming to Chicago. What do you think? I don't know. I don't know that there's a question there. Can you expound on?
Oh, sure.
This?
I can talk about this
because the Clarist. Thank you. Yeah.
It's absolutely fascinating. So, just a little bit of background. Elisar von Kupfer set up something called the Elisarian, which was the temple to this Clarist cult in a small city called Minuzio, on a lake in Switzerland, the part of Switzerland that borders Italy, so it's actually quite tropical, palm trees and all. And he set it up there in part, I think, because to show you that there's nothing new under the sun. There was a place called Monte Verita there earlier, and it was, believe it or not, a vegan nudist colony from the mid-19th century. So he figured, well, if they can handle, nudist vegans, they can probably handle a Clarist. And Clarism was something in between a religion and a politics, a form of political activism. It certainly had religious aspects, but it was also understood as a political refuge for like-minded, what we would call queers, from all over Europe at the very moment that the Oscar Wilde trials are making things pretty hot. And what Clarism held centrally was that it was a misunderstanding of divine order to think in terms of male and female, to think in terms of binaries. That all beings had both male and female aspects. Genitalia was hardly the defining aspect of that. And yet, one of the things that von Kupfer was rather proud of was his slightly feminized form, which he demonstrated in nude photography. But that the clarest ideal, therefore, was to eliminate any kind of binary at the very moment that a term, homosexual, which turns on gender clarity, was in ascendance. So what von Kupfer was fighting for was saying, wait, we're going on the wrong path here. If we go down the line of clear gender distinction, we will win the battle, perhaps, but lose the war. What we need to do instead is to eliminate distinctions among all the different gender possibilities and gender expressions there are. And that, he said, is the divine way.
If I could just do a tiny follow-up about the win the battle versus the war, it's my understanding that Hirschfeld was trying to do this work of defining the homosexual to sort of challenge or at least ameliorate some of the harsh laws in Germany and Europe at the time.
Exactly.
Right, and so it was that. It was like a concession or it made like. I guess a question could be: do you believe that Hirschfeld actually believed strongly in the binary, or he was instrumentalizing this to try to gain some ground for the rights of homosexuals or queer people?
I think he was groping in the dark, as everyone was at the time. And so what Hirschfeld wanted to do was to find a biological basis for homosexuality, because if it was inborn, he felt it could not be outlawed. He had the best of intentions, but the results were horrific. He, for example, implanted a testicle from a heteronormative man into a homosexual man to see if that could change things, and complications including infection ensued. So this was a very early moment in the development of all this. I think, like a lot of Germans at the time, Hirschfeld felt that the only way queers were going to gain a measure of legal protection was by establishing it as a natural category. And what we have, therefore, is a fascinating moment in the very origin of the homosexual, of a split in ideas about how we move forward. One essentially trying to create a space within a binarized or polarized society, and the other one saying, let's just get rid of all of that. Let's get rid of the binary. Now, what I imagine Hirschfeld would have said to somebody like von Kupfer is, I'm practical, you're not.
Those do not sound like arguments on the left that are too divorced from today.
No.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a recurring theme of, especially what we're talking about and the show itself, is this kind of cyclical nature of history in general, but also like queer discourse. It just kind of always comes back to the same thing with like a modern interpretation.
Exactly right.
Like Lady Gaga, Born This Way, is still
Yeah,
inflecting.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But,
and I think that one of the things that I wanted the show to underscore is that whereas we now can look upon the advent of the homosexual with a bit of dread and say, oh boy, that was not necessarily the best social experiment we engaged in, for many people at the time, it was profoundly liberatory. It finally gave them a name, a category, and it allowed them to join, and this is central, it allowed them to join with others. And thus they could develop a political movement.
Yeah.
And that was key.
Totally. We were thinking a little bit in discussing this show about the moment that ASMR, I don't know if you're familiar with that, the strange brain tingles that people get when people are whispering or crinkling candy wrappers. It kind of was named for the first time like 10 years ago, and people understood whether or not they had this thing that they maybe only thought they experienced, or that they thought maybe everyone experienced and just didn't talk about. But when science discovered ASMR, they were like, oh, I'm this. And I think that that's happening more today. Like, there are a number of people in their 30s and 40s who are watching like queer youth start to identify as non-binary or against spectra, or feel like they have, categories that were not to some people evident or available. And so I've had 40-year-old friends say, well, if I knew that I could have been non-binary in high school, I would have gone for that. I would have understood that to be what I am. But without that language, I feel like it's too late for me now, or I didn't come in the right era. And so I'm leaning into that kind of complication that you're evidencing, that having the language to understand something close to what your sort of intersecting identities are can be liberatory, as you're saying.
Exactly. And there's therefore really moving work. Like, there's a work by a Canadian painter who moved in with her lover, and it's called The Threshold. And it shows the lover in bridal garb, and she's painted her according to the old tradition that you carry your beloved over the threshold. But it dates from the late 19th century. This is the kind of thing that we're trying to bring out, that the complications of all of this. It's not a clean story. History is never a clean story.
With that said, though, like, you're maybe in talking about this period of the definition of the homosexual, heterosexual binary, you're doing it in the past tense a little bit, right? And in your exhibition talk on the Rightwood website, you sort of you talk about people today having grown up in that binary, and then you make this kind of like small caveat or aside, and you say, well, maybe everybody but those under 25.
Yes.
And I guess, like, I'd like for you to expand on that. Like, are people under 25 in kind of a different paradigm that is like after the death of homosexuality? Does this show kind of like conduct a funeral for that era of the binary? Does it sort of elegize it?
I don't think we can make any kind of big statement about it being past, because it's so geographically specific. I would say that within certain social, classed, and geographically specific locales in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago, we may be past this. But I think we are in a very different sphere when we look at most of the country, not to mention the rest of the world. It is going to be a long haul. Homosexuality as a category wasn't established overnight, and its end is not going to happen quickly. What we're going to see, I think, is a continuous irony, which is that the more we inhabit the word homosexual and march under that banner, the less actual difference is perceived between homo and hetero, and the term itself begins to disappear. In other words, once we have, paradoxically, homosexual rights, gay rights, right? Then the distinction between gay and straight begins to be obliterated. And eventually, it won't be useful anymore.
Do you think we're moving towards that in this moment in time, or is it more of just, because I feel like in my like community, and it's kind of just spiraling in on itself and kind of going through the same motions over again. And there's little niche pockets, of course, but there's very much a section of like the community that's online kind of rehashing same things over again.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like real life activism out here. And I feel like they're two very different sorts of
Well, I teach young people,
yeah.
and one of the things that I keep finding is that among young people, these distinctions just don't count. When I started teaching queer studies, 98% of my class was queer identified. Now it's 50%,
Wow.
and it's going down. And that's exactly
Interesting.
right. In fact, I remember wistfully one of my great undergraduates coming into my office after 4 years of classes with me, majoring in the field, and then sort of quietly seeking to say something and then bursting into tears. And I'm trying to understand what she's saying. And I'm like, I'm sorry, could you say it again? Could you say it again? And finally I hear, I'm straight. And I thought, oh, Nirvana, here we go. So
funny.
I do think that it's generational. And I do think that I have enormous hope that within, we're not talking overnight, but within 50 to 75 years, this attitude will change. And the country will come to understand that sexuality isn't binary.
Have you seen with like maybe this show or maybe prior shows kind of the impact of if you have like youth attending these kinds of exhibitions and how they interact with it? I feel like queer art is definitely something that affects you when you realize this is something about yourself. Like I remember my first Felix Gonzalez tours at the Art Institute. I was there bawling, looking at a pile of candy, just like everybody else. But have you kind of had a moment where you're able to see that maybe glimpse into the future with your attendees?
I have. One of the things that's really interesting is that a lot of the interpreters at the at Rightwood 659 are themselves quite young, and they don't need to have this idea of homo hetero in a non-binary relationship explained to them. They get it immediately and intuitively. What I find actually really interesting is the older people, and I count myself among them, so this is not a slight, that when we look at this show, we glimpse rather longingly a possibility that wasn't extended to us and that we look forward to finally seeing realized. I think that the goal here has long been, even in the most sort of activist mode of gay rights, the mode here is ultimately not to be divided by our sexuality, but to come to understand that there were other issues that dominated and that determined our oppression. Sexuality shouldn't be one of them.
Wow, I want to keep going on this segment, but I want to make sure that we have time to talk a little bit about the future of this exhibition. I understand that there were COVID complications, maybe like being able to secure certain works. Yeah. And so that's sort of like, hinted at. A lot of the folks who were speaking in the very reverent space of the show were asking some of these interpreters in the Rightwood space, like, will there be a catalog? Like, this show is so important. And the interpreters were assuring them there's going to be a catalog. The show is coming back in a fuller form. We talked about the Clarist work coming to the U.S. for the first time. Can you talk about not only the complications that you faced mounting this show in COVID, but then also what you're looking forward to about the next version of the show?
Absolutely. So in 2025, the full exhibition, the one that we had originally planned to do, will be shown. We were getting work getting started on the work on this when COVID hit. And so as a result, we ended up losing a number of the works that we had been promised. A number of museums actually ceased to offer any kind of loan opportunities at all.
Wow.
But we were able to get a number of works nonetheless, but just a smaller number. So we decided to do the sort of shorter show and then 25 to do the full show. And that full show will be accompanied by a major scholarly catalog, the leading figures in the world in their various regions will be writing the catalog essays.
Wow.
And the show will be much more global than it is now. But to just give you an idea of some of the complications that we ran into, we had requests out to a number of museums in Russia. And needless to say, I got actually a very sweet note from the head of the Russian, one of the Russian museums that said, "I'm sorry, given the current political situation, it seems loans are not possible. I look forward to the day when they can return."
Wow.
And so we were, for example, stuck because we had a whole number of Russian artists, central figures that we wanted to show, and we had no possibility. And then it occurred to us that maybe we could borrow from Ukraine. And then it was this very strange question of how do you borrow works in the middle of a hot war? And what we found was that you can. And so we borrowed 8 works from the Odessa Museum.
Wow.
And then, thankfully, we're able to get the curator of those works out of Ukraine and into the United States.
Wow.
And so we were able to rescue work and people, and that was great.
Wow. Whew. So, we have to go to a station ID again soon, but I guess I can just preview that it would be interesting to talk about those Russian artists that or Ukrainian artists that were from the Odessa Museum, and a number of other artists from certain backgrounds and countries that gathered in Paris, and the sort of affinity culture that existed for many of these artists at the time. In a city and a state where there were less restrictive laws, and so we want to talk about that as it relates to maybe your experience in queer-run and artist-run projects that maybe have fewer concerns about censorship, et cetera. So that's a sort of preview, but yeah, we got a station ID.
Yeah. You're listening to WLPN LP Chicago 105.5 FM Lumpen Radio. We're here with Jonathan D. Katz, curator of the first homosexual exhibition on display currently at Wrightwood 659. We're currently discussing some complications that kind of came up with having such a global show, not just the pandemic, but also Ukrainian and Russian artworks.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I was speaking to that. Maybe we can just start with that sort of this sort of like safety that artists, as you note, with a certain level of privilege, were able to find safety and affinity with each other in Paris and in the Swiss town that you were mentioning, the Clarists gathered in. Yeah, I guess just if you can talk a little bit about that, and we can move from there. Yeah.
Sure. So one of the good things that Napoleon did, there weren't many, but one of the good things that Napoleon did was in 1804 outlaw discrimination against same-sex relationships. Now that law didn't actually translate into a pro-queer culture because there were always ways around laws, and in France in particular, one of the ways around laws was to say, okay, you can't bust people for homosexuality, but you can bust them for solicitation. And so in a culture that basically prevented queer people from meeting one another, parks, bathrooms, etc., were places where you'd go and there were cops everywhere. nonetheless, within French culture, there was greater possibility and greater freedom, especially for those economically empowered. And so France became one of the nodes of this cultural moment. And people came to France, like Somov, the Russian artist I was referencing earlier, came to France and found a measure of peace in France, especially because his high hopes for the Russian Revolution, eliminating backward homophobic law, were not actually delivered on.
Just a
But
clarification, though, like it was law, right, after 1917. Like the law was abolished in Russia, but you're saying that the
it didn't actually change the social attitudes. And we keep thinking that laws change social attitudes, and in fact, it's always the other way around, right?
You mean that
And,
when they are enacted, people actually like maybe have reactionary responses, like when there is maybe like there are laws protecting gender affirming care, people get madder or something, maybe.
well, I think in many respects, one of the things that we keep noticing is that dinosaurs squawk before they go extinct. Um, and so we're in the squawking phase, right? And this is often a long phase. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
But one of the things that is interesting is that we find certain cities emerging as centers, and part of that is that the city reaches a certain density, and part of that is that I think. Well, here's a good example. We have a text about a trans woman in Buenos Aires. She keeps it's fascinating because again it's early 20th century, late 19th century. She keeps getting busted for walking the streets in women's clothes, and she keeps insisting that she's a woman, and they keep showing her masculine biological features, and she says, "No, I'm a woman." And so they arrest her, and she spends a couple of days in jail. They release her. She goes back out on the street dressed in women's clothing, and they keep doing this. And they finally say to her, "You can't keep doing this." And she says, "I don't know what the problem is. Why you're harassing a woman?" These are the moments of great cultural power.
When you talk about like cities and maybe like a critical mass or something that happens there, I want to think about for a second your move from this city, your favorite city. I'm just going to reiterate that that's on record, Chicago, to San Francisco, to set up some of some spaces like this in a city that might have been most appropriate for that. And I'm talking specifically about the Harvey Milk Institute and also the Queer Arts Festival, which we did some research on, but didn't find enough about. Being at an artist-run space and queer-run projects that you've worked on up through Lohman and then and Wrightwood, I'm curious about that sort of like one of those first iterations where you were instrumental in founding these research and arts spaces.
Sure. So, I left Chicago because I got a job. I finished my degree and I got a job in San Francisco directing what was then called the Lesbian and Gay Studies Department at the City College of San Francisco, which was the first queer studies department in any American university.
Wow.
And I did that for 10 years, and it was really very it allowed me to practically implement what I had long studied. But while I was there, I noticed that that the queer political movement tended, not surprisingly, towards politics. And I've always felt that culture was one of the key spheres of political engagement. And so began a series of organizations. You mentioned the Harvey Milk Institute. So this Harvey Milk Institute was a basically a large-scale public institution of higher education. At its height, it had over 3,000 students.
Wow.
Um, and it offered an enormous range of classes. Fees were very minimal, and the guiding principle was that you could be interested, as indeed the catalog made clear, in a class on the political implications of Foucauldian thought today, and another class called Journey to Uranus about anal pleasure, right? And that they could be one in the same semester.
Amazing.
And that was okay. And so it really did what it set out to do, which was to provide alternative education to queer people in San Francisco. But one of the other things that we did was set up, as you know, the National Queer Arts Festival. And the National Queer Arts Festival presented a number of key queer figures, Bill T. Jones, a number of artists. There were exhibitions every year, fairly major exhibitions. A lot of cultural figures that were quietly queer, but we were able to present more firmly within that sphere, like the avant-garde performer Meredith Monk. And so the festival really began to get traction as a place to see very, very interesting figures. And it emphasized forms of intersectionality and diversity, which were very much in keeping with the politics of San Francisco at large. And all of this, importantly, came about because a study was done just before the festival was broached that looked at arts funding in the city of San Francisco as supported by the city. And not surprisingly, it found that 90-something% of it went to the opera, the symphony, and the major museums, right? And so because it was San Francisco, we were able to introduce policies that asked the city to broaden its giving.
Wow. And then what happened to each of those kind of independent but super significant initiatives or projects?
The Harvey Milk Institute finally died when I left and several other people left the city of San Francisco. It was a labor of love. There wasn't any money in it, and it was sort of hard to sustain without ridiculous dedication. The National Queer Arts Festival still actually is alive and well, still doing exhibitions, still bringing people. I think it's working now, and maybe this is appropriate, more with lesser known and younger figures, because this possibility of bringing in major names is now more general. You can bring in big name queer people at standard venues, and that's great.
And maybe that parallels the history of the Leslie Lohman Museum, which was originally a gallery, which you were also instrumental in starting as the founding president. I don't know. Is that sort of trajectory similar, right? Where they're now showing kind of like younger and more emerging artists than was once, or was it always kind of a mix?
No, it was always sort of kind of a free-for-all. In fact, it began because of AIDS.
Right.
Because it was increasingly clear that families were throwing away work by queer artists that deceased members of the family had left behind, including major works, right? There was just no place. Families were offended that their loved ones had these collections and they were destroying them. So we created Leslie Lohman in part to take those collections. But earlier, Charles Leslie and Fritz Lohman, the two founders, had a gallery and were showing not to make money, but simply to create opportunities for exhibition, a number of queer artists.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, we realized that we could turn that entity into a museum, and that's what we've done. Uh, it's it's gone through a number of different phases of emphasis. Sometimes it emphasized sort of big names, major figures, but aspects of those figures that aren't widely acknowledged as queer. Sometimes it's as it just does younger artists, and it's now moving increasingly internationally.
We're wrapping up. I don't know. I want to give you a little space at the end for you to sort of let us know what's coming up for you. But you want to ask the funny question about the time in history?
Yeah, well, I think we've covered a lot of different eras of like queerness and homosexuality and that kind of identity. And so since you've yourself spent a lot of time in those different spaces, is if you had to pick one to kind of live in and embody and experience, what era would you love to be in?
That's a really interesting question. I think my go-to isn't the past, it's the future. I keep thinking that if I was just 2 generations younger, I could grow up with a lot of the scars that I grew up with. And I look forward to those scarless youth. I had an experience, I mean, this is very strange, but it was only 5 years ago. I was teaching a class and I talked about the wide diversity of queer people and that the only thing we have in common is coming out. And one of my students raised their hand and said, I never came out. And I was like, what? How could you never come out? And this kid said, oh, I told my mom I liked boys when I was 10, and I just never came out. Everybody knew I was queer from the moment I was sexual. And I thought, wow.
Wow.
Can you imagine what that world looks like?
Wow, that's such a good note to end on. But I do want to just give a little bit of space. We have a couple minutes. If you wouldn't mind sort of like talking about what you're excited about to be working on right now that maybe we haven't covered, maybe the colonialism exhibition, for instance?
Yes. So this dispossession exhibition, which will be opening in 2014 at Wrightwood, is a kind of summary of 15 exhibitions that are taking place in Latin America. We won a Mellon grant to support the development of exhibitions related to the theme of dispossession.
Wow.
And so, for example, this will be your opportunity to see work by trans artists in Latin America, and some of it is extraordinarily beautiful. We're going to be bringing in, for example, this hand-woven sweater by a trans artist. It's hard to describe. Suffices to say that the idea that you can make this remarkable, and you'll see what I mean when you see the sweater, remarkable sweater for yourself is a political act as well as an aesthetic one. And we're also talking about a lot of the issues that currently bedevil Latin American indigenous communities and the connection between homophobia and colonialism. One of the exhibitions begins with a poster that says that heterosexuality is a colonial imposition. And that is one of the animating ideas, that indigenous culture did not have the same construct around a binary sexuality, that people who had different genders and different sexualities were celebrated. So all of this is going to be in evidence through works of art, and they will be the best works of art from the various exhibitions. And those exhibitions are opening. Chile is opening in a couple of days. Lima, Peru is open now. The exhibition Lima, Peru is open now.
Wow.
And I'm very proud to say that the exhibition, after it closes in the museum, is being loaded on barges and sent down the Amazon to the
No
indigenous
way.
communities.
Wow.
So we are trying to actually take the work into the world
Wow.
of its genesis.
Oh my gosh. Well, maybe you'll allow us to have another conversation again when that exhibition makes its debut in Chicago.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What an exciting time in art world, and we're really grateful and thankful for you to spend some time with us, Jonathan, today. This has been a Lumpen special coverage. We're here speaking with Jonathan D. Katz, curator of the First Homosexuals Global Depictions of a New Identity over at Wrightwood 659. This has been Sydney Baluch and
Nick Wylie.
We're happy to have Nick, and we're going to keep bringing him back as we start to have more queer content for Lumpen in 2023. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And Jonathan, again, thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Like religious, I'm really sure that this overturning like really has affected